Krell had seen better days, and he had certainly seen better auctions than this one. The Therian salvage dealer sat in his cramped ship. His forearms crossed over his chest as he scrolled through the listings on his data screen with growing frustration. His mottled blue skin had lost its shine years ago, worn down by decades of hard work in the scrap trade. And his patience had worn down right along with it. Most of the lots were garbage, broken mining equipment, contaminated cargo pods, and debris fields that would cost more to collect than they were worth. But then his eyes caught something unusual at the bottom of the list. Lot 7734. Abandoned orbital hangar in the Black Veil sector. Contents unknown, presumed debris, atmosphere vented. Structure integrity at 23%. Starting bid, 5 galactic credits, the Black Veil sector. Krell knew that name, and so did everyone else in this part of the galaxy. It had been quarantined for over 3,000 years, sealed off by the old powers for reasons that nobody remembered anymore. Some said it was a plague zone. Others claimed it was full of spatial anomalies that would tear a ship apart. A few whispered about ancient weapons and forbidden technology, but quarantine zones meant opportunity for salvagers brave enough or desperate enough to enter them. And Krell was definitely desperate. He placed a bid of 11 credits. Never expecting to win 3 hours later, the confirmation message arrived on his screen, and Krell stared at it for a long time before he finally accepted what had happened. He now owned a piece of the most mysterious sector in known space. For less than the price of a hot meal, his ship, the Honest Prophet, was an ugly vessel held together by patches and prayers. But she had never failed him yet. Krell spent 2 days preparing for the journey, loading up on emergency supplies and triple-checking his vacuum suit. His wife called him a fool. His business partner called him worse. But something in his gut told him this was the find he had been waiting for his entire career. The journey took 3 weeks through restricted space, and every day brought new warnings from his navigation computer about unauthorized travel and legal consequences. Krell ignored them all. He had bought this hangar fair and square, and no ancient quarantine was going to stop him from claiming his property when the Honest Prophet finally dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Black Veil sector. Krell felt his twin hearts beat faster in his chest. The nebula stretched out before him like a wound in space itself. Purple and black clouds of gas swirling around dead stars and forgotten stations. His sensors picked up dozens of derelict vessels drifting in the darkness, their hulls cracked open and their crews long dead. Whatever had happened here 3,000 years ago, it had been catastrophic. Krell found his hangar after 6 hours of careful navigation through the debris field. The B station was old, older than anything he had ever seen in his 30 years of salvage work. Its design was completely unfamiliar, all sharp angles and heavy armor plating that spoke of military construction. The outer sections had crumbled away over the centuries, exposing corridors and chambers to the vacuum of space. But the central hangar bay remained intact, protected by blast doors thick enough to survive a small war. His docking clamps engaged with a shutter that ran through the entire ship. And Krell grabbed his helmet and his scanner and made his way to the airlock. The moment he stepped inside the station, his equipment went crazy. Temperature readings spiked and dropped at random. His motion sensors detected movement in at least 6 different directions. His radiation detector screamed warnings that made no sense, and underneath it all, his scanner picked up a heat signature that should have been impossible in a station that had been dead for millennia. Something was alive in Krell almost turned back. His hand was on the airlock control, ready to seal the door and run back to his ship and forget this whole foolish adventure. But then he thought about his debts, about his family, about the years of struggle that had led him to this moment. And he forced himself to keep moving forward. The corridor was dark, lit only by the beam of his helmet light. Dust floated in the vacuum, undisturbed for centuries until his boots kicked it up with each step. The walls were covered in writing that his translation software struggled to identify, finally displaying a result that made his blood run cold. Tiara, an extinct species pre-collapse. A human scroll had heard stories about the humans. Of course, everyone had. They were the great mystery of galactic history. A species that had risen from nothing to challenge the old powers, only to vanish completely during the collapse. No one knew exactly what had happened to them. The records from that era were fragmentary and contradictory, full of gaps and classified sections that no one had ever been able to access. But here, in this forgotten corner of space, Krell had found something that the humans had left behind. He reached the hangar bay doors and found them sealed tight. His cutting torch took nearly an hour to burn through the lock, but when the doors finally groaned open, Krell forgot all about his tired arms and his aching back. The ship inside was beautiful. It hung suspended in the zero gravity of the hangar, perfectly preserved despite the millennia that had passed. Its hull was dark and angular, covered in the same strange script he had seen in the corridors. And it was massive, easily 10 times the size of his own vessel, with weapon mounts and sensor arrays that spoke of incredible power. Krell had just found an intact human warship, and he was going to be rich beyond his wildest dreams. But then his helmet light caught something moving in the shadows beneath the ship, and his celebration died in his throat. There was something down there, something that had been waiting in the darkness for a very, very long time, and as Krell watched, frozen in place by terror he could not explain, the thing began to move toward him. Krell's species had excellent night vision, a gift from evolution on a world where the sun barely rose above the horizon. But what he saw in the darkness of that ancient hangar made him wish he was blind. The figure that emerged from the shadows beneath the warship was humanoid in shape, but that was where any comfort ended. It wore what remained of a military vacuum suit. The fabric fused to its body in places where repairs had been made with desperate hands and crude tools. Patches of dried skin stretched over a frame that should have crumbled to dust thousands of years ago, and where its eyes should have been, 2 amber lights glowed with a soft and terrible awareness. It was impossible. Nothing biological could survive this long in a dead station. Yet here it stood, watching him with the patient stillness of a predator that had all the time in the universe. "You are not authorized to access this vessel." The thing said. Its voice was wrong in ways that made Krell's skin crawl. The vocal cords were clearly damaged, producing a rasping sound that no living creature should make. But underneath that broken whisper was the smooth hum of synthetic enhancement, as if machines were speaking through a corpse across. Universal translators struggled with the ancient dialect for several seconds before finally producing words he could understand. "Identify yourself and state your intention," the Guardian continued, taking one slow step forward in the harsh beam of his helmet light. Krell could see the full horror of what stood before him now. One arm was completely missing, replaced by mechanical grafts that looked like they had been assembled from station components. The chest plate of the vacuum suit had been torn away at some point, revealing a cavity where internal organs should have been. Instead, he saw a tangled mess of tubes and wires and biological tissue that pulsed with artificial life. This creature had been repairing itself for centuries, keeping itself alive through methods that made Krell want to vomit inside his helmet. "I bought this hangar," Krell managed to say, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to control it. "At auction. It is legal. I have the documents. This station belongs to me now." The amber eyes flickered, processing his words. "Ownership claims from external parties are not recognized," the Guardian replied. "This facility is the property of the United Earth Navy. Access is restricted to authorized personnel only." Krell felt a surge of frustration push through his fear. He had traveled for 3 weeks and spent his last credits on this venture. And now some ancient horror was telling him he could not claim what was rightfully his. The United Earth Navy does not exist anymore, he said, forcing confidence into his voice that he did not feel. The humans are gone. They have been gone for 3,000 years. There is no one left to authorize anything. The Guardian was silent for a long moment when it spoke again. Something had changed in its synthetic voice, something that almost sounded like grief. I am aware of the current status of my species, it said. The last transmission from Earth was received 3,217 years ago. It stated that the collapse was total. No further communications have followed since that date. Krell stared at the creature, trying to comprehend what he was hearing. This thing, this patchwork nightmare of flesh and machine, had been alone in this station for over 3 millennia, waiting for orders that would never come from a civilization that no longer existed. Who are you? He asked, his fear giving way to something that felt almost like pity. I am Chief Petty Officer Elena Vasquez, the Guardian replied. United Earth Navy, assigned to the crew of the U.S. Prometheus. I am the last surviving member of this vessel. My orders are to protect it until I am relieved by proper authority. But there is no proper authority, Krell said. Not anymore. Then I will continue to wait, Elena Vasquez answered simply. The words hung in the vacuum between them, and Krell realized with growing horror that she meant it completely. This human, or what remained of her, would stand guard over this ship until the stars themselves burned out, because that was what her orders demanded. How is this possible? He asked, gesturing at her ruined body. How can you still be alive after so long? The amber eyes turned to look at the warship behind her, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that pressed down on Krell's soul. I have died 17 times in this hangar, Elena said. 17 times my heart has stopped beating. 17 times my brain has been deprived of oxygen long enough to cause permanent damage. 17 times I have crossed over into the darkness and felt the cold embrace of death wrap itself around me. She turned back to face him, and somehow those mechanical eyes managed to convey emotion that chilled him more than any threat could have. And 17 times I have dragged myself back, because my duty is not yet complete. Krell had encountered many strange things in his years as a salvage dealer. Alien artifacts, ancient technologies, beings from the far edges of known space. But nothing had prepared him for this. A creature that simply refused to accept death because it had a job to do. The emergency rations ran out after the first century. Elena continued, her voice matter-of-fact despite the horror of what she was describing. I learned to synthesize nutrients from the fungus growing in the lower sections of the station. When that became insufficient, I found other sources. She did not elaborate. And Krell did not ask her to when the loneliness became too great. I disabled my emotional processing centers for decades at a time. When my body failed, I rebuilt it with whatever materials I could find. I am no longer entirely human by any biological definition of the word. She took another step toward him, and Krell forced himself not to retreat. But I am still a sailor of the United Earth Navy, and I will not abandon my post. Krell looked at the ancient warship floating in the hangar, then back at the nightmare standing guard beneath it. And he understood at last why the humans had been so feared. Before their extinction, it was not their weapons or their technology or their numbers that had made them dangerous. It was this absolute refusal to surrender, this stubborn determination that burned so hot it could keep a dead woman walking for 3,000 years. The galaxy had tried to kill humanity, and they had succeeded by every measure that mattered. But somehow, impossibly, one of them was still here, and she was still fighting. Krell did not leave the station that night, or the night after that. Something kept him there in the darkness with the ancient guardian. a fascination that he could not explain even to himself. He told his wife over the long-range communicator that he was still assessing the salvage value of the find, and that was partly true. But the real reason was simpler and stranger than any business calculation. Wanted to understand, Elena Vasquez did not sleep. She had not slept in over 2,000 years. She told him because the parts of her brain that required rest had been replaced with systems that ran on power cells instead of biological processes. But she seemed to welcome his company in a way that made Krell's hearts ache with sympathy. She had been alone for so long that the simple act of conversation was like water to someone dying of thirst over the following days. Krell learned the truth about what had happened to humanity, and each new piece of information made the horror grow larger in his mind. We were a young species by galactic standards, Elena explained as they sat in the command center of her station, the only room where she had maintained atmosphere for the occasions when she needed to perform repairs on her biological components. We had only been traveling among the stars for 300 years when we made contact with the hegemony. Krell knew the name. The hegemony had been the dominant power in the galaxy before the collapse. A coalition of ancient species that had ruled for tens of thousands of years before falling apart in circumstances that historians still debated. They did not like us, Elena continued. And there was a darkness in her synthetic voice that made Krell shift uncomfortably in his seat. We were too aggressive, they said, too unpredictable, too willing to fight for things that more civilized species would simply accept. They called us a contamination, a disease that needed to be eliminated before we could spread. They attacked you? Krell asked. They exterminated us, Elena replied. And the word hung in the recycled air like poison. It was not a war. A war implies that both sides have a chance to win. This was a cleansing. They burned Earth first, sterilizing the surface with weapons that turned our oceans to steam and our cities to glass. Then they moved to the colonies, killing every man and woman and child they could find, her mechanical hand clenched into a fist, servos whining with the pressure. They hunted our refugee ships, Krell. They tracked down families fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and they murdered them in the cold of space. They were thorough, they were patient, and they were absolutely certain that they were doing the right thing. Krell felt sick. His species had done terrible things to each other throughout their history, but nothing on this scale, nothing so complete and so deliberate. How did you survive? He asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment before answering. The Prometheus was a seed ship, she said. One of 48 vessels designed in our final years. When we knew that the war was lost, each ship carried genetic samples from millions of humans, along with embryonic templates and terraforming equipment. The plan was to scatter across the galaxy and hide until the hegemony fell apart or forgot about us. What happened to the other ships? The hegemony found them, Elena replied. One by one, over the course of 2 centuries. They tracked down and destroyed every seed ship they could locate. 47 vessels, 47 chances for humanity to survive. All of them wiped out. She turned to look at the viewport, where the dark shape of the Prometheus hung in the hangar like a sleeping giant. They missed us. We were damaged in the initial attack and forced to take shelter in this nebula. Our communications array was destroyed, so we could not contact the others. And our engines were too damaged to leave. We thought we were stranded. But it turned out that our prison was also our salvation. Krell followed her gaze to the ship. The hegemony searched for us. Elena continued. For 200 years they sent probes and scout ships into every corner of the galaxy, looking for any sign of human survivors. But the nebula hid us from their sensors. And eventually, they declared their mission complete. Humanity was officially extinct. But you were still here. Yes, Elena said. I was still here. She stood and walked to the viewport, her mechanical legs clicking against the metal floor with each step. The rest of my crew did not survive the first century. Some died from their wounds, others took their own lives when the isolation became too much to bear. The captain was the last to go. She held on for 87 years before her body finally gave out. Elena pressed her remaining hand against the cold glass. She made me promise to keep the ship safe, to wait for rescue that we both knew would never come, to protect the future of our species, even though we were the only ones who remembered that it had ever existed. And you have been here ever since. Krell said softly, yes, that night. Krell accessed the galactic archives from his ship, searching for any records of the human extinction. What he found confirmed everything Elena had told him, but it also revealed something else, something that made his blood run cold, the Volturi Concordance. One of the major powers in the current galactic order were the direct descendants of the species that had led the hegemony 3,000 years ago. The same civilization that had ordered the extermination of humanity was still out there, still powerful, still watching over the quarantine zones where they had buried their greatest crime. And Krell had just found proof of what they had done. Looked at the ancient station floating outside his viewport, at the impossible woman who had kept herself alive through sheer willpower for 30 centuries. And he understood that this was no longer just a salvage operation. This was something much bigger and much more dangerous. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Krell made his decision 3 days after learning the truth about what had happened to humanity. Stop trying to claim the warship instead. He sat down across from the ancient guardian in the atmospheric chamber of the station, and he asked her a question that no one had asked in over 3,000 years. What do you need? Elena Vasquez was silent for so long that Krell began to wonder if her systems had frozen. Her amber eyes flickered with patterns he could not interpret, and her mechanical hand twitched against her leg as if she was fighting some internal battle. When she finally spoke, her synthetic voice cracked in a way that sounded almost like tears. I do not understand the question. You have been here alone for 3 millennia, Krell said gently. You have kept yourself alive through methods that I cannot even imagine. You have done your duty beyond any reasonable expectation. Now I am asking you, what do you need? Elena stared at him with those glowing eyes, and for a moment, Krell saw past the horror of what she had become to the person she had once been. A young woman who had joined the Navy to see the stars, who had been given a mission she never asked for, who had sacrificed everything, including her own humanity, to fulfill a promise made to a dying captain. I need help, she whispered. And the admission seemed to cost her more than any of the 17 deaths she had described. I have done everything I can with the resources available to me, but I am failing. The ship systems are degrading faster than I can repair them. The genetic samples are beginning to decay. The embryonic templates are losing viability. She looked at the viewport, at the dark shape of the Prometheus floating in the hangar. I have kept them alive for 3,000 years, but I cannot keep them alive for 3,000 more. Soon the last hope of my species will be gone, and everything I have suffered will have been for nothing. Krell felt something shift inside him, a resolve that surprised him with its strength. Then we will find a way, he said. Together, what followed was the strangest partnership in the history of the Galaxicroll. Used his salvage contacts to acquire replacement parts for the station's failing systems, calling in favors he had earned over 30 years in the scrap trade. His wife thought he had lost his mind. His business partner refused to speak to him, but Krell kept working, kept smuggling supplies into the quarantine zone, kept returning to the station where the last human-weighted medical supplies were the hardest to obtain. The technology needed to repair Elena's failing body was centuries beyond anything currently available in the legitimate market. But the black market was a different story. Krell spent every credit he had saved, and then he borrowed more. And then he made promises he knew he might not be able to keep finally, After 8 months of searching, he found what he was looking for, a cloned tissue regeneration pod, stolen from a military research facility and sold by criminals who had no idea of its true value the day he brought it to the station. Elena looked at the device for a long time without speaking. "This will not make me human again," she said at last. "No," Krell agreed, "but it will make you stronger. And we are going to need you at your best for what comes next." While the regeneration pod worked its slow miracle on Elena's damaged body, she granted Krell access to something far more valuable than any technology. The Prometheus's historical database. It contained everything, the complete scientific knowledge of a dead civilization, physics, chemistry, biology, engineering, and fields that Krell had never even heard of. Technologies that the current galactic powers had spent millennia trying to develop, already perfected by a species that had been murdered before they could share their gifts with the universe. But it was not the technology that made Krell's breath catch in his throat. The database also contained music, art, literature, philosophy, the stories that humans had told each other around campfires and in concert halls, the paintings they had created to capture beauty they could not express in words, the questions they had asked about the nature of existence and the meaning of life. It was the soul of a people, preserved in digital form while their bodies turned to Ashkrul, spent hours listening to their music. Strange and beautiful melodies that moved him in ways he could not explain. He read their poetry, translated imperfectly by his software, but still powerful enough to bring tears to his eyes. He watched recordings of their cities, their celebrations, their ordinary lives. Billions of people who had loved and worked and dreamed. All of them gone now except for this fragile archive. Why did they fear you so much? He asked Elena one day. Why did the hegemony think you were so dangerous? Elena's body had healed significantly in the regeneration pod. Her skin was smooth again. Her missing arm replaced by a cloned limb that worked almost as well as the original. Only her eyes remained artificial. The amber glow a permanent reminder of what she had survived. "Because we would not give up," she said. Other species faced with impossible odds would surrender, would negotiate, would accept their fate. But humans kept fighting even when victory was impossible. We adapted, we endured. We found ways to survive that no one expected. She smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Krell had seen on her face. They did not fear our weapons or our technology. They feared what we represented. The idea that the universe does not get to decide when you stop trying. Krell looked at the Prometheus, fully restored now with the help of Therian engineers working from human blueprints. And he finally understood what he had found in this forgotten hangar. "This is not just a warship," he said softly. "It is an ark." "Yes," Elena replied. "Inside those medical pods are over 10,000 embryonic templates, each one a potential human being waiting to be born. We are not just preserving history, Krell." She placed her hand on the hull of the ancient vessel, and her amber eyes glowed with fierce determination. "We are preserving a future, and I think it is time to wake the passengers." The news spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. Rumors of human technology appearing on the black market had been circulating for months, but most dismissed them as fantasy or fraud. The humans were extinct. Everyone knew that. Their civilization had been wiped out during the collapse, and nothing remained of their species but fragments and ghost stories. Then, the broadcast began. Krell had prepared carefully for this moment. He had spent the last year building a network of contacts across dozens of worlds. Journalists and historians and scientists who would listen to what he had to say when the time was right. He activated every communication channel he could reach and began transmitting. The first images showed the Prometheus in all its restored glory, its dark hull gleaming under the lights of the hangar as its ancient engines hummed with awakening power. The second images showed the medical pods inside the ship, thousands of them arranged in careful rows. Their monitoring systems displaying vital signs that should have been impossible. The third image was Elena Vasquez. She stood at the bridge of her ship, no longer the patchwork horror that Krell had found in the darkness, but a woman rebuilt, scarred, augmented, forever changed by her centuries of survival, but unmistakably alive. Her amber eyes looked directly into the camera, and her voice was clear and strong as it echoed across 1,000 worlds. "My name is Chief Petty Officer Elena Vasquez of the United Earth Navy," she said. 3,000 years ago, the hegemony declared war on my species. They burned our homeworld, slaughtered our colonies, and hunted our refugees across the stars. They believed they had succeeded in erasing us from existence. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of 3 millennia of solitude. They were wrong. The reaction was immediate, and overwhelming. Scientists demanded access to the human archives. Their technology alone would revolutionize 6 fields of research. Historians clamored for interviews, for records, for any scrap of information about the legendary species that had vanished so completely. Ordinary citizens watched the broadcasts in stunned silence, trying to comprehend that the ghost stories of their childhood were real. But not everyone welcomed the news. The Valkyrie Concordance responded within hours. Their ambassador appeared on every official channel, his pale face twisted with barely contained rage as he denounced the broadcasts as a hoax and a provocation. The quarantine of the Black Veil sector was in place for good reasons, he insisted, and any violation of that quarantine was an act of terrorism that would be dealt with accordingly. Behind the diplomatic language, the threat was clear. The descendants of the hegemony would not allow humanity to return. The fleet arrived 3 days later. 12 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the nebula, their weapons charged and their shields raised. The Valkyrie commander broadcast his demands across all frequencies: surrender the human vessel and its contents for immediate destruction, or face the consequence. Skrull watched the fleet approach from the bridge of the Prometheus, his 4 hands trembling with fear. He had known this moment would come, had prepared for it as best he could, but the reality of facing the most powerful military force in the sector was enough to make his twin hearts skip several beats. Elena stood beside him, her amber eyes fixed on the tactical display. "They are demanding your surrender," Krell said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Elena replied calmly. "They are. What are we going to do?" Elena turned to face him, and there was something in her expression that Krell had never seen before. Not anger, not fear, but a cold and absolute certainty that made his blood run cold. "We are going to show them why they're ancestors. We're so afraid of us," she said. The broadcast that followed was transmitted live to every news network in the galaxy. Billions of beings watched as Elena Vasquez appeared on their screens, standing in front of the ancient warship that had become the most famous vessel in known space. Behind her, Krell could be seen at the communications console, relaying the signal to every corner of civilization. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she began, her voice steady and clear. 3,000 years ago, your ancestors murdered 8 billion of my people. They burned our world, slaughtered our children, and declared us extinct." The Valkyrie fleet commander interrupted the broadcast with his own transmission, demanding that she cease her provocation and submit to lawful authority. Elena ignored him completely. "I have survived 30 centuries in the darkness of this nebula," she continued. "I have died 17 times and dragged myself back to life through sheer force of will. I have watched my crewmates perish one by one while I kept our mission alive. I have done things that would break the minds of lesser beings, and I have done them without complaint or hesitation." She took a step forward, and her amber eyes seemed to glow brighter. "I did not do this because I wanted to live. I did it because I made a promise to my captain, to my crew, to the 8 billion souls who were murdered while the galaxy watched and did nothing. I promised them that humanity would not end, that their sacrifice would not be in vain, that someday the children of Earth would walk among the stars again. The fleet commander was screaming now, ordering his ships to advance, to destroy the station before she could finish speaking. But something was happening. Ships across the sector were refusing to move, their crews frozen by what they were witnessing. "You think you can threaten me?" Elena asked, and her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout. "You think your fleet frightens me? I have stared into the void for 3,000 years. I have felt my heart stop beating and chosen to restart it through will alone. I have experienced horrors that your species cannot imagine." She smiled. "And it was the most terrifying thing Krell had ever seen. I am offering you one chance. Leave this system now, and tell your masters that humanity has returned. We do not seek revenge. We seek only to live in peace. But if you force our hand, if you try to finish what your ancestors started, then I will show you exactly what a human being is capable of when they have nothing left to lose." The fleet commander laughed, a harsh sound that crackled across the communication channels. "You have one ancient ship," he sneered. "What can you possibly do against 12 modern warships?" Elena's smile widened. "I have been asking myself that question for 3,000 years," she said. "Would you like to find out the answer?" For a long moment, nothing moved. The galaxy held its breath as the Valkyrie commander weighed his options, his hand hovering over the command that would launch his attack. Then, the Prometheus completed its final awakening sequence across the ship. 1,000 medical pods activated simultaneously. Their lids slid open with a soft hiss, and the vital signs monitors began displaying the steady heartbeats of the first human beings, born in over 3 millennia. Tiny hands reached upward. New voices cried out in confusion and wonder, and standing watch over their cradle. A duty finally complete after 30 centuries of darkness. Was the woman who had simply refused to let her species die. The Valkyrie fleet withdrew without firing a single shot. History would record that moment as the beginning of the Second Terran Age, the day when humanity returned from extinction to reclaim their place among the stars. Scholars would write volumes about the technological renaissance that followed, about the diplomatic upheavals and the uncomfortable questions that the elder species were forced to confront about their own histories. But the children of the Prometheus would remember something simpler. They would remember the story of their guardian, the woman who had waited alone in the darkness for 3,000 years because someone had to. They would remember her sacrifice, her determination, her absolute refusal to accept defeat even when all hope was gone. When asked, in her final interview before she entered cryogenic sleep to rest at last, what had kept her going through the endless centuries of isolation, Elena Vasquez had offered only a shrug. "Someone had to," she said. "And I was the only one left." It was, the new humans agreed, the most terrifying thing any species in the galaxy had ever said, because it meant that no matter what the universe threw at them, no matter how impossible the odds or how complete the destruction, there would always be one human somewhere who simply refused to quit, and that single stubborn soul would be enough to bring them back from the dead.